The long bones can be broken down into various regions along their length. At each end of a long bone is the region called the epiphysis. Now remember, we find long bones primarily in the arms and the legs, as well as the hands and the feet. So we can describe a proximal epiphysis, and then on the other end of the bone, a distal epiphysis. The proximal epiphysis is going to be at the end of the long bone that is closer to the body axis, and the distal epiphysis is going to be on the other end. When you look into the epiphysis of a long bone, you'll find compact bone surrounding spongy bone. There is no cavity in the middle of the epiphysis. And because the epiphysis is at the ends of the long bones, they are also covered in articular cartilage. Now, if you go inward from the epiphysis, the next region you'll hit is called the metaphysis. And there is a metaphysis area at each end. The metaphysis is also compact bone surrounding spongy bone. There's no cavity in the metaphysis. Now, within the metaphysis, there is a region referred to as the growth plate. Now, the technical term for the growth plate is the epiphyseal plate. It's the growth plate at each end of a long bone that is the location where more bone can be added and the bone can grow in length. So the growth plate stays open in children and adolescents, and it will eventually close up once the person has reached their full growth. Once the epiphyseal plate closes, it becomes a much more narrow line through the metaphysis. It becomes what we call the epiphyseal line. While it's open, the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate is composed of hyaline cartilage. The remaining area in a long bone is called the shaft of the bone, and that is the diaphysis. It's actually the diaphysis of a long bone that provides the strength to the long bone. That's where most of the weight bearing in the bone comes from. If you look at the diaphysis, you will find cortical bone surrounding spongy bone, which surrounds a cavity, and that cavity is called the medullary cavity. It's inside the medullary cavity that you'll find marrow. In the long bones of a child, all of the marrow will be red marrow. But as we age and become adults, most of the marrow is replaced with yellow marrow, and only a small amount of red marrow is left. Around the surface of the long bones is a layer of material called the periosteum. And when you look at the medullary cavity, there's a layer that lines that cavity called the endosteum. On the left-hand side of this slide, you can see a drawing of a long bone. This happens to be the femur. And the bone has been cut in half along its length so we can peer inside. This is the head of the femur. This would be in contact with the hip. And this end of the femur would be part of the knee joint. So this is referred to as the proximal epiphysis. And this would be the distal epiphysis. Closer to the body axis, that's proximal. Farther away, that's distal. The epiphysis contains cortical bone on the outside and then spongy bone on the inside. Just underneath the epiphysis is the metaphysis. The metaphysis ends right where that medullary cavity begins. It's also made out of cortical bone on the outside, spongy bone on the inside. But it's inside the metaphysis that we will find the growth plate in children and adolescents who are still growing. And we would find just the epiphyseal line left over in an adult who has stopped growing. Here's the metaphysis on the other end of the bone. There would be another growth plate or line at this end. And then the remaining length of the bone, the shaft of the bone, is the diaphysis. And what sets the diaphysis apart is the medullary cavity. There's cortical bone on the outside, spongy bone underneath, and then a cavity in the middle. Periosteum would be found covering the whole outer surface of this bone, and endosteum lines the medullary cavity. On the right-hand side of this slide, you're looking at a radiograph of the knee. So just to orient you, this is the femur, this is the tibia. Right next to the tibia is the fibula, and this is the knee joint. You can just see the shadow of the patella right here, the kneecap. Now all of this gray area that you see in here, that's the space inside of the joint. You can't see muscle or tendon or ligament because those don't show up on a radiograph. Only bone does. Now you can also see a line right here through the tibia. There's another one here through the fibula. And then there's a line here through the femur. These are growth plates. Now because there's still a space in there that looks gray, dark gray, I know that that is still a plate and it's full of cartilage. Cartilage shows up as the darker gray or black color. So this is still a person who is growing, and because their growth plates are still open, they still contain cartilage. These bones are still growing. Periosteum covers the outer surface of all of the long bones, and in fact of all of the bones in the body. The only place where you don't find periosteum is in the areas where there is articular cartilage. Periosteum is actually a pretty thick layer of tissue. It has an outer layer and an inner layer to it. The outer layer is the more fibrous layer, the tougher layer, if you will, and the inner layer is full of cells. So the outer layer of the periosteum is what protects the bone underneath. It's also important because it's an attachment site. It's a place where blood vessels can anchor to the bone. It's a place where nerves can anchor to the bone. And it's also an attachment site for any ligaments or tendons that are going to need to attach to the bone. The inner part of the periosteum is the cellular layer, and in that inner layer you will find all of the cells that you find in bone. You'll find what are called osteoprogenitor cells. Those are the stem cells of bone. Osteocytes, those are sort of the general bone cells. Osteoblasts, those are the cells that are able to make new bone. And osteoclasts, those are the cells that are able to remove bone. Now the lining of the medullary cavity is called endosteum, and it's very similar to periosteum, except the cellularity is a little different. You won't find any osteocytes in the endosteum, but you will find the other types of bone cells. If we look at the drawing, and I'm just going to move it here so we can see it a little better. The artist has drawn for us half of a long bone, so the bone's been cut right here. The drawing on the very end of the bone, where you see the light bluish colored material, that represents articular cartilage. And then under that, we're looking at some spongy bone. The cortical bone, remember, is found on the outside part of the bone. Now, this area up here would be epiphysis. What's underneath would be metaphysis. And then you'd start getting into diaphysis. Remember, it's the diaphysis that provides the real strength, the real weight bearing to a long bone. And I think you can see in this drawing that the cortical bone gets much thicker in that area. Now, there is periosteum all over the surface of this bone in all of the areas except where the articular cartilage is. And the artist has drawn a little place here where the periosteum is peeled up, peeled away from the surface of the bone. There's also a layer lining the medullary cavity, and that's endosteum. When it comes to the anatomy of the other types of bone in the human body, the short bones, the flat bones, the irregular bones, the thing to know is that those types of bones have no medullary cavity. You only find the medullary cavity in the long bones. All of the rest of these bones will have cortical bone on the outside, compact bone, and spongy bone underneath. Now there's one exception to that, and there's a new term for us. That's the flat bones of the skull. In between the inner and outer layers of the flat bones of the skull, there is a special type of spongy bone. It's called diploe. It's just spongy bone. It has all of the characteristics of spongy or trabecular bone, but it gets this special name because of where it lies. When you look at these flat bones and when you hold them in your hands, you would swear, they're so thin, you would swear that they were just solid cortical bone. But in actuality, there is a thin layer of spongy bone in between the two layers of cortical bone, and that's where the diploe is. So let's take a minute now and take a look at the bone cells and what each bone cell is doing. Remember, there are stem cells called osteoprogenitor cells. There are osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Osteoprogenitor cells, like all stem cells, are basically an immature type of a cell that has no real identity yet. Just a very immature form of a cell. And like all stem cells, when these osteoprogenitor cells divide, they make one new stem cell, and they make one cell that will go on to become a type of bone cell. And that type of bone cell is an osteoblast. Osteoblasts are identifiable because they have a real cuboidal shape to them. And the job of an osteoblast is to make new osteoid. Osteoid, or what we sometimes call bone matrix, is simply the ECM of bone. It's the extracellular matrix of bone. It's a special kind of extracellular matrix, though, that is only found in bone. This osteoid, this bone matrix that is secreted by the osteoblasts, is going to become mineralized. It's going to become hardened, and it's actually going to trap some of the osteoblasts inside of it. Those are going to go on to mature and become osteocytes. The remaining osteoblasts will stay as osteoblasts. Now, once an osteoblast becomes an osteocyte, it has a new job to do. And that new job is to just maintain the matrix of the bone. The osteoblasts synthesize it and secrete it. The osteocytes maintain it. They take care of it. Osteocytes have their own unique shape because they tend to develop these membrane projections, these little finger projections, similar to the dendritic cells that we looked at when we talked about the integument. In addition to maintaining the matrix, the osteocytes are able to detect the different kinds of mechanical stresses that get applied to bones every day. When the osteocyte detects mechanical stress, it will actually send out chemical signals, and the osteoblasts in the area will start making more and more of the bone matrix, more of the osteoid, in an effort to strengthen the bone. The final cell type that we find is the osteoclast, and this is a type of cell that's capable of removing bone through a process that we call bone resorption. Osteoclasts are fascinating cells. They have several different nuclei inside of them, which is very unusual. They also have an irregular border around them. They're referred to as having ruffled edges. And these are phagocytic cells. These are cells that consume other material, and that other material is bone. So let's take a minute now and talk about bone matrix. Let's talk about this special kind of extracellular matrix. Remember, all extracellular matrix is made out of protein fibers, ground substance, and water. What makes osteoid unique is that the protein fibers are collagen fibers, and the ground substance is made out of two chemicals called proteoglycan and glycoproteins. So this combination of the collagen and the proteoglycan and the glycoproteins and the water makes this material that we call osteoid. Now, osteoid is considered the organic part of bone matrix, and that word organic just means carbon containing. There is also an inorganic portion to bone matrix, and that is salts. So no carbon here, just different types of salts, and primarily salts that contain calcium. So there are things like calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide and calcium carbonate. There are also salts like just plain old sodium chloride and magnesium and even fluoride and sulfate. There's a big combination of inorganic salt material that makes up this inorganic portion of bone matrix. Now, the important name for you to remember is this one: hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is the primary material in this inorganic portion of bone matrix. It's made out of calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide together. So again, lots of calcium here. Hydroxyapatite is going to get deposited in and around the collagen fibers in the osteoid. And it's going to help harden that osteoid material to make bone. Now, I mentioned earlier that bone is a very dynamic type of connective tissue. It is constantly being remodeled, even in fully grown adults. The organic and the inorganic portions of bone have to be very carefully balanced with each other, and the body is constantly tweaking these two portions. When people lose a lot of protein or they produce abnormal forms of these proteins, they end up with what we call brittle bones. In comparison, when they don't have enough calcium, in other words, enough to build hydroxyapatite, they end up with what we call soft bones. Now, I once heard a person describe the balancing act in bone as being like the construction of a foundation for a building. You know that when they're making a foundation, they are not only pouring concrete, but they're also adding rebar into the concrete to give it reinforcement, to give it strength. Well, when a person does not have the collagen that they need to build osteoid, it's almost like they are trying to build a foundation with just rebar. There's no concrete around the rebar, and it makes the bone very brittle. When a person has insufficient calcium in their body, so they don't have enough hydroxyapatite, it's as though they're building bone just with the concrete, and they're not putting any rebar into it. And that gives them soft bones. So think of bone as being like reinforced concrete. The osteoid with the protein fibers in it is like the rebar, and the hydroxyapatite is like the concrete. It's the osteoblasts in bone that are making and secreting the osteoid that will become bone matrix. The hydroxyapatite material is going to get deposited in and among the fibers in the osteoid to create that bone matrix. Osteoid has to harden, it has to calcify, it has to mineralize to become that very stiff material that we think of, very solid material that we think of as bone. Calcium and phosphate are the primary minerals that help bone harden, and they have to be kept in a very strict balance in order to precipitate out and mineralize the bone. Now, there are two vitamins that are critical to this process. The first one is vitamin D, and the second one is vitamin C. We talked about vitamin D a little bit when we talked about the integument. Vitamin D is really important for the absorption of calcium through the GI tract. So a person can be eating a diet that is rich in calcium, but if they don't have adequate levels of vitamin D, the calcium is just passing right through their intestinal tract and not being absorbed very well. In comparison, vitamin C is required for the normal formation of collagen fibers in the osteoid. You probably are familiar with the historical example of rickets. You're probably familiar with stories that you may have heard of sailors who would go out to sea for months and months at a time and who did not have the opportunity to eat fresh fruits and vegetables, and so would become deficient in vitamin C and would go on to develop rickets. Both of these vitamins are critical for healthy bone. Osteoclasts are doing the work of removing bone from established bone. They are eating away bone as part of this balancing process. The way they do that is by releasing a type of enzyme called proteolytic enzyme, and that enzyme is capable of breaking down bone matrix. Proteolytic enzymes are a family of enzymes, and they are produced by and released by lysosomes. They can break down some of the materials in the bone matrix. They can break down the collagen fibers, because collagen is just protein. They can break down proteoglycan and even those glycoproteins. The acidic environment that gets created during this process will just dissolve away the hydroxyapatite, and all of the calcium and the phosphate that is part of the hydroxyapatite will just be released and it will get absorbed into the bloodstream. What's interesting is that people who have low levels of blood calcium will go into a state of increased bone resorption. In other words, a low calcium level in the blood will trigger an increased activity of osteoclasts so that bone can be broken down and more calcium can be absorbed into the blood. Remember, calcium is a critical ion for lots of processes in the human body. The body will draw calcium out of the bones if it needs to. And this often happens in people who are nutritionally deficient.